Hello everyone, my name is Anya. Welcome to my YouTube channel on this day. For what I've learned throughout my life is that a lot can happen in a single day. So I want to use this channel to talk about certain events that happened on a particular day of a certain year. The event could happen last year. Well, we all know what happened last year. It could have happened 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or 50 years ago, 100 years ago. Hell, it could even have happened 1,000 years ago. I want to use this channel to talk about what happened on a particular day of the year. So for my first video, I want to talk about what happened on this day in the year 1944. So this is an event that happened during the Second World War, and it involves probably one of the most famous people to ever come out of the Holocaust. This is an account of the day the Nazis finally came for her, and her name was Anne Frank. So who was Anne Frank? I'm not going to go too deep into her story because I'm sure you all know who she is. I'm just going to reiterate the basic facts. Anneliese Marie Frank was born on the 12th of June 1929 in what was then known as Frankfurt am Main, Germany. She was the younger daughter of Otto and Edith Frank. She had an older sister, Margot, who was born in 1926. In 1933, with the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party, the Frank family, along with thousands of others, were forced to flee Germany and emigrate to other countries. The Frank family would settle in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Otto Frank would establish a business there. Margot and Anne would enroll in the local schools. Anne, in particular, settled into life in Amsterdam very, very easily. She had a very chatty demeanour, she had a friendly nature, and she drew people in very, very easily, even if her chatty nature would sometimes get her into trouble at school. But overall, her life in Amsterdam was a very, very happy one. Unfortunately for Anne, the happy times would come to an end in 1940 when the Netherlands were invaded by the Nazis. Right away, she, along with thousands of other Jews, were faced with extremely difficult restrictions imposed by Hitler's Nazi regime. Anne would lose out on the things that she loved to do, going to the theatre, go figure skating, meeting up with friends in ice cream parlours, going out on ferries, cars, all the things in life that nowadays we would take for granted very, very easily. Yet despite all of these restrictions, she still found ways to enjoy life. She remained a very positive figure and she found ways to make the most of things. When Anne was 13 in 1942, she would receive what was to become probably one of the most widely read books in the world, her diary. She would begin writing her diary on the 12th of June, and she would use it to write about herself, her friends, her family, the hardships that she had to endure because of the Nazis, and her diary would become a strong source of comfort when she and her family were forced to go into hiding on the 6th of July 1942. A day prior to that, Margot Frank had received a call of notice to be sent for deportation to a work camp. Now, the Frank family had a sense that this was going to happen, but they never expected it to happen to the children. They always expected it to happen to either Otto or Edith Frank. So they had originally planned to go into hiding on the 16th of July, but the summons for Margot had forced them to push the plan forward. So on the 5th of July 1942, the Frank family were forced to go into hiding on 263 Prinsengracht, Amsterdam, which was actually the building where Otto Frank ran his business until he was forced to give it up due to the Jewish restrictions. The Frank family went into hiding behind a small bookcase, which hid several different rooms behind it. On the 13th of July 1942, the Frank family were joined by another family, the Van Pels. Herman Van Pels, who had been Otto Frank's business partner, his wife Auguste, and their 16-year-old son Peter. The Van Pels family had emigrated from Osnabrück in Germany in 1937. In November 1942, both families were joined by an eighth person, a dentist by the name of Fritz Pfeffer. Fritz Pfeffer was also an emigrant from Germany. He had fled to the Netherlands in 1938 with his fiancée, having sent his young son Werner off to live in England. So 8 people cooped up together in small rooms behind a bookcase. The 8 people were helped out by 4 trusted confidants: Maëpiece, who was one of Otto Frank's closest friends and confidants, a secretary by the name of Bette Vosgeil, and 2 workhouse workers, Victor Kugler and Johannes Kleiman. The families, Fritz Pfeffer, they would spend 2 years hiding behind this bookcase. Imagine that, 2 years cooped up behind a small bookcase. They had to follow a strict routine every single day, getting up early, having breakfast, making sure they remained as quiet as possible. So you see, not everybody in the building knew that people were in hiding, so the families were forced to remain as quiet as possible. They could only move about in stocking feet, and they could only speak whenever they wanted to in a whisper. That was almost like this, and you could hardly hear. They had to stay like this for 2 years. So 8 different people cooped up in small rooms. It was not a healthy environment for anybody. There were arguments, there were disputes, there were disagreements, and Anne would write about all of this in her diary. Her diary became her source of escape from everything. In 1944, Anne realised her dream to become a writer, and she hoped to one day publish her diary and give an insight into what life was really like in hiding. So she began to edit her diary, take out things that weren't of interest, put in new things that would have been better suited. And she continued to do this up until her last entry, which was dated the 1st of August 1944. Which brings us to what happened on this day in 1944. So as usual, the 8 people in hiding were up by 6:45 a.m. They would get washed, they would get dressed, they put their night things away, and they would prepare themselves for when the workmen came in at 8 o'clock. Fritz Pfeffer would go off and do his own thing. Edith Frank would take up some sewing or knitting. Herman and Auguste Van Pels would put themselves in the kitchen. Anne and Margot Frank and Peter Van Pels, they would do their schoolwork with Otto Frank helping them out. So on this day, Otto Frank took Peter Van Pels up to Peter's room to give him an English lesson. And for that time being, everything was grand, everything was normal. They were just going about what they would normally do to pass the time. At 10:30 a.m, a car would pull up outside 263 Prinsengracht. Inside the car were several civilian-clothed Dutch police officers and a Nazi officer by the name of Karl Silberbauer. They were here because they had received a tip-off that Jews were being held in hiding in that building. Silberbauer would lead the Dutch police up to the office where Miep Kies and Victor Kugler were working. And Victor Kugler was forced at gunpoint to take the officers around a tour of the building. And he agreed to do so, and the last place that he took them was the landing where the bookcase was standing. And once the officers began prodding at the bookcase, Victor Kugler knew they had been betrayed. It was over. The officers fiddled around with the bookcase until they found the fastener that opened the door behind it. And they opened the door, they made their way inside, and the first room they entered was where Edith Frank was, and all she could do was put her hands up in surrender when she was faced with the officers brandishing their guns. An officer would go into the next room and pull out her 2 daughters. Fritz Pfeffer would be dragged out from his place, and everyone would be hog-marched upstairs to where Herman and Auguste Van Pels were sitting in fright in the kitchen. Meanwhile, Otto Frank was still giving Peter Van Pels his English lesson, and it was at that point that Otto Frank began to hear loud noises, lots of banging, shouting, screaming. He didn't understand what was going on. He was thinking, why are people making noises? We have to be quiet. All of a sudden, he and Peter were confronted by a man wielding a gun. And at that point, Otto Frank knew it was over. People in hiding were forced into a corner by the officers, and they were interrogated by Karl Silberbauer. Silberbauer could not believe that 8 people hiding behind a bookcase could have stayed hidden for just over 2 years. Otto Frank actually showed him a chart on a wall where he had measured Anne and Margot Frank's heights for the last 2 years. Silberbauer demanded that the 8 people give up all their jewels, their valuables, their money. An officer would go round gathering up all the valuables, and needing a place to put it all, he grabbed a nearby briefcase. Anne could only watch in silence as her diaries, her letters, her stories, her papers all fell to the floor like they were worth nothing. The officer would use the briefcase to gather up all the jewellery and valuables. Silberbauer would then tell the 8 people that they had 5 minutes to pack a bag as there was a truck waiting down below to take them for deportation. Now here is where the story takes a slight turn. Otto Frank pulled out a trunk from under one of the beds. Silberbauer ordered him to open it, and he was astonished to learn that this trunk had actually belonged to Otto Frank when he served as an officer in the First World War. Silberbauer was stunned. He couldn't understand why Otto Frank hadn't registered as a former officer. In his eyes, Otto Frank and his family would have been treated in his eyes as decent. In his eyes, Otto Frank could have possibly been sent to a camp called Theresienstadt in what was then known as Czechoslovakia. This actually shows the naivety of the Nazi officers. They didn't know the true realities of the labour camps, the work camps, the death camps. They did not know the harsh and brutal conditions that Jews were forced to endure every single day. In the end, all Silberbauer could do was tell the 8 people, "No rush, take your time, take as long as you need." Meanwhile, Miep Gies and Victor Kugler were still being held up in the office. Beth Buskyle would arrive shortly, and Miep ordered her to take some important papers out of the office before the Nazi officer could get their hands on them. Miep Gies and Victor Kugler were both interrogated by Silberbauer, but Miep actually recognised Silberbauer's accent. Both her and Silberbauer originated from Austria. Because of this, she was allowed to remain at the office. Victor Kugler was not so lucky. He was arrested, and alongside Johannes Kleiman, they were taken down to the truck where the 8 people were being forced into. And so the 8 people could only come down the stairs and enter the truck, which took them away from 263 Prinsengasse for the last time. A few hours after the arrest, Miep Gies, Beth Buskyle and a workhouseman, Van Maren, would go up the stairs and try to gather up some valuables that had been left behind. It was Miep Gies who discovered Anne's diaries and her letters all scattered on the floor. She was the one who gathered it all up along with some school books and some family photo albums and brought everything downstairs to a drawer. She put everything into the drawer and said she would return everything to Anne when she came back from the camps. A week after the arrest, the entire annex was emptied out of all its furniture, its content. Everything was removed on orders by the Nazis, and to this day there is still no furniture left behind in the secret annex. After the arrest, Victor Kugler and Johannes Kleiman were both sent to a political prisoners camp. Because of his poor health, Johannes Kleiman was able to be released on orders from the Dutch Red Cross a few weeks later. Victor Kugler would be moved between several different camps for the next several months until he managed to escape in March 1945. He was finally able to return to Amsterdam 2 months later. The 8 people in hiding were sent to a deportation camp in Westerbork in the Netherlands. They would stay there for a month until the 3rd of September 1944, where they were all forced onto the last train ever sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest death camp in Poland. They would arrive on the night of the 5th of September 1944. Immediately, men and women were separated, with men going one way, women going the other, and unfortunately for Anne, she would never see her father again. All the prisoners went through a selection. Those who were deemed fit to work would be sent off to get their heads shaved, have numbers tattooed on their arms, and get dressed in prisoners' clothing. Those who were too sick to work, they would be sent to the gas chambers. Such was the case for Herman van Pels. Now, he was not selected right there when he arrived. He actually was deemed fit to work when they first arrived at Auschwitz. But 2 or 3 days into working in Auschwitz, he mentally gave up. That was the beginning of the end for any worker in the death camps. Shortly after he just gave up, Herman van Pels injured his hand and was sent to the sick barracks. During the sweep-up of the sick barracks, Herman van Pels was rounded up with several other prisoners and he was sent to the gas chambers. What makes this even more tragic is that his son Peter and Otto Frank were actually witnesses to the selection. Peter Van Pels could only watch as his father was sent off to his death. As for Fritz Pfeffer, he was sent from Auschwitz-Birkenau to another camp called Neuengamme, somewhere near Hamburg in Germany. He would contract cholera and die on the 20th of December 1944 at the age of 55. As for the women, in October 1944, Anne and her sister Margot were forcibly separated from their mother Edith and sent off to another camp in Germany called Bergen-Belsen. From eyewitness testimony, Edith Frank would suffer a mental breakdown from the separation of her daughters. She would go around the camp asking where her daughters were, despite the fact that she had seen them be sent off in the train to Bergen-Belsen. She would store several morsels of food, whatever she could, in the hopes of giving it to Anne and Margot. Partly due to this, Edith Frank would die of starvation on the 6th of January 1945. She was just 10 days short of her 45th birthday and just 3 weeks away from Auschwitz being liberated. Meanwhile, for Auguste Van Pels, she would also be moved through various different camps. She was also moved to Bergen-Belsen, but only stayed there a short time before she was moved to another camp in Germany called Buchenwald. From Buchenwald, she was sent on a transfer to a camp called Theresienstadt. It was during that transit that Auguste Van Pels was murdered. The date of her death has never been determined, but it's determined that she was thrown in front of a train by one of the Nazi guards sometime in the spring of 1945. Her son Peter will be sent on a death march from Auschwitz to a camp called Mauthausen in Austria. Now, Otto Frank had begged Peter not to go. Peter, being 18 years old at the time, he thought he was young, he could make it. He did make it to Mauthausen, but the conditions there were just as terrible as they were in Auschwitz. Peter Van Pels was forced to endure extremely difficult hard labour and starvation. He ultimately died in May 1945 at the age of 18. Now, the date of Peter Van Pels' death varies. Some people say he died on the 5th of May 1945, others say he died on the 10th of May 1945. But it's known that Peter Van Pels died sometime around the time Mauthausen was liberated, which is absolutely heartbreaking. He was just some time away from liberation and he just couldn't take any more. As for Anne and Margot Frank, they would stay in Bergen-Belsen and the conditions there were terrible. They were forced into tiny tents, and after the tents were blown down, they were moved into tiny workhouses where overcrampedness, sickness caused them to contract typhus. Now, the dates of the deaths of Anne and Margot Frank have never been fully determined. For many, many years, it was believed they died in March 1945, just before the camp was liberated, but some research done in 2015 said they could have died as early as February. But we do know some basic facts. Because of the fact that Anne contracted typhus, she was contracting lice and fleas in her clothes. She had thrown all of her clothes away, and she literally could only wear one thin blanket. Now, sometime during this, Margot Frank was extremely weak. One day, trying to get up out of her bunk, she slipped and fell out onto the floor. Because of her weakened state, the shock of the fall killed Margot instantly, and Anne would die a few days after her sister. The bodies of both Frank's girls were buried in a mass grave in Bergen-Belsen, and the camp was liberated in April 1945. Of the 8 people who were in hiding, Otto Frank was the only survivor. He was set free when Auschwitz was liberated on the 27th of January 1945. It wasn't until May of that year that he finally managed to return to Amsterdam. During his journeys, he had learned that Edith was dead, but he held on to the hopes that Anne and Margot were still alive. Tragically, just 2 months later, Otto Frank would receive word that both of his daughters had died in Bergen-Belsen. When it was clear that Anne was never coming back, Miep Kies, who had rescued Anne's diary from the annex, she would give all of Anne's writings to her father Otto. It would take Otto Frank some time to be able to read his daughter's diary, but ultimately he would begin the process of having Anne's diary published and sent out into the world. Anne's Diary has become one of the most widely read non-fiction books in the world. It's been published into multiple different languages. It has had a Broadway play adapted. It's had a feature film adapted that won 3 Academy Awards in the 1950s. And now thousands of people every year travel to what is now known as the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam to see where Anne, her family, the Van Pels and Fritz Pfeffer were held in hiding for 2 years. As for the arresting officer, Karl Silberbauer, he was finally tracked down in 1962 where he was working as a police officer in Vienna. When it was clear that he was the one who had arrested Anne Frank and sent her off to her death, he was suspended from his job and he was interrogated. Believe it or not, Silberbauer actually had many memories of the 4th of August 1944. He remembered who Anne was, he remembered who Otto Frank was, and he was able to give in detail what had happened on that particular day. He remembered how Otto Frank stood Anne by the wall where he had measured her and Margot's heights for 2 years. Silberbauer remembered he had even remarked to Otto Frank that, quote, "You have a lovely daughter." Unfortunately, Silberbauer had no knowledge as to who it was that had actually sent off the tip that there were Jews in hiding. Ultimately, he was allowed to return to his role as a police officer, and he lived the rest of his life in Vienna until he died in 1972 at the age of 61. Otto Frank, he had mixed feelings about Silberbauer. He understood that Karl Silberbauer was only doing his duty as an officer at the time. He didn't really hold any ill will towards Silberbauer, but he did make the request that he never have to look that man in the face again. It was too difficult for Otto Frank to confront the man who had arrested his entire family. That request was ultimately granted. For the rest of his life, Otto Frank would devote his time to spreading his daughter's story and giving people lessons about intolerance and discrimination. Otto Frank would ultimately die in 1980 at the age of 91. Unfortunately, throughout the years, despite numerous investigations, it's never been determined who it was that actually sent the betrayal off and allowed Anne and her family to be arrested. And now, decades later, we may never really know who it was that contacted the Nazis and informed them there were people in hiding. We'll never know who it was that allowed the Nazis to finally arrive for Anne. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it. I'm super excited to be starting this journey on this channel. It's something that I considered doing in the past, but this last year has certainly given me the kick that I needed to get started. Comment down below if you have any suggestions on what you would like me to cover in the future, and I look forward to seeing you guys again in my next video. Until then, my name is Anya, and we have just looked at what happened on this day.